Our final panelist needs very little introduction. She is an icon in the field. Her gender critical beliefs are not worthy of respect in a democratic society. Need I say any more? She writes with such logic and such clarity on single-sex provision. And I've said this to her, I sometimes feel like when I read her writing, it feels like I've drank a long, cool glass of water. It's with great pleasure that I introduce to the conference Maya Forstater.
Thank you.
Hi Maya, how are you?
I'm good. I feel so honoured to be here. I'm a bit of a cuckoo in the nest. I have no Irish blood whatsoever. I have no English blood either. My parents are Jewish and American and Polish and Japanese immigrants to this country. So, and I haven't done many public appearances since the court case. I've written quite a lot, but I haven't done many events. I haven't done a lot of video or public events, and it's time to start doing them. So when you asked me, I thought this was a perfect thing to kind of start with, because it feels like we are, I think, reaching something of a tipping point in the UK, and hopefully that can sort of help others and help our nearest neighbour. So I'm really just delighted to be here and sort of tell my story and tell you what we're doing here and the organisation Sex Matters, which we launched on Friday.
Before we get into the kind of the meat of the questions, there's no entry requirement for getting involved in the conversation in Ireland, and we're just very honoured to have you as one of the thought leaders. We do have, which is very heartening actually, some people just getting in touch and wanting to help us who aren't Irish at all. I mean, the vast majority of us are Irish living in Ireland, but some are diaspora, and then just women who care and can see what's happening in Ireland and want to help out. We had one member join us recently whose name was Maura, and I kept presuming she was Irish and kept telling her actually almost that she was Irish, saying, Maura is an anglicised version of Mora, M-A-I. And then eventually she kind of sheepishly said, no, it's Mara, I'm actually Spanish. So I was like trying to tell her she was Irish. And I was trying to pronounce your name earlier, wasn't I? Saying, how do I say this? Is it for start? And I was so conscious with an Irish accent, I was going to say it the wrong way, but you told me it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, exactly.
So I firstly, I think a lot of us will have come to know about your role in all of this and your activism through your case. I mean, I remember personally trawling through the paper and trying to find out more about this case. And it was very much a moment for me in my awakening about this whole issue, about gender ideology. And I had this strange compulsion. I wanted to go and sort of pick it outside wherever the case was to support you. I just felt, gosh, women are being fired, Can you just talk us through the case, the timeline up to the case, and obviously it's ongoing because you are appealing, just so people are across, what happened?
Sure. So, so kind of my timeline, similar to Fiona's, I think, started really in 2017 when I first started to notice this issue. And the thing that I remember sort of pricking up my ears about was Jenny Murray, the BBC Women's Hour presenter, who had written an article in one of the newspapers saying trans women are trans women. That's great. They should be able to live freely and be respected in their identity, but they're not women. It's not the same thing. And I'd read the article and thought, that sounds sensible. I didn't really know very much about the issue. And then, similar to kind of you wanting to pick it outside my case, then there was all of this furore over Jenny Murray, and she was cancelled from events and, pointed out as being this terrible bigot for writing something which seemed to be, common sense and humane to me. This is a story that we could tell many times with J.K. Rowling, with me, with, that there are so many versions of this story, but that was the first one that sort of made me notice that something wasn't what I thought it was. And what I thought it was it's like gay rights, it's a human rights issue, it's straightforward, it's about acceptance and so on. And so I started paying attention, and I started paying attention on Twitter, and sort of just reading things and following things, and it took me about 18 months of doing that before I felt confident in my own opinion, that I knew what I was talking about, that that I wasn't misunderstanding, I wasn't a bigot, I was I had concerns, particularly around the UK government at the time was proposing self-ID. And so it was sort of around September 2018, I kind of came out as gender critical. And I did it there was sort of, I got to the point of I'd been following women like Kathleen Stock, like Jane Clare Jones, like Posey Parker, and thinking, they're really brave. Yeah. And then I was thinking, well, if I think they're brave, why aren't I saying anything? And so I thought about the things that I could do, as myself. And I'm a researcher. I worked for an international development think tank. I write for a living, I research for a living. But I'm also a mum, and I'm a scout leader, or I was a scout leader. And so I sort of started from where I was and sort of followed the relationships I had. So I wrote to my MP, I donated to a crowdfunder, which is, you can do that anonymously. It was a sort of safe thing to do. I posted in my local mum's Facebook group, which got a reaction of, how dare you, you're a bigot, which was, the first time I'd really had that, and that was quite a shock. I wrote to the Scouts about their safeguarding policy, and I started to tweet. And the first tweets I wrote was I don't think I've spent so long writing 4 really boring tweets before. They were like, please read this consultation, read this article from Fair Play for Women, respond to this government consultation. It was the sort of safest and most careful tweet I'd ever written, and nothing happened. Nobody responded to it. And I had about 2,000 followers. They were policy people, they empirical people who like to argue about issues and policies, and nothing. And and I was sort of getting angrier and wanting, it's eerie when people won't talk about an issue. And so I tweeted about Karen White, as that was happening at the time, the male prisoner who was put into the women's prison here and who sexually assaulted prisoners. So that was in the news. I tweeted about that, and still nothing. And so then I decided to try to ask my followers on Twitter a question that related to their own life, because I think people could see that, oh, this is a difficult issue, it's a controversial issue, you'll get in hot water if you talk about it, and I don't have to deal with this. Prison policy, someone else can deal with it. Even sports, somebody else can deal with it. And so in international development, where I work, lots of men have taken this pledge on, if they're invited to be on a panel at a conference and it's all men, that they will tell the conference organizers, no, I won't do a panel unless there's a woman on it. And so they either stand down or they can make the panel bigger or whatever. It's to say, there are women who know about things. And lots of the men in my field had sort of made this pledge publicly, and it's something that they're doing for women. And so it was the story of Pip's Bunch, which Fiona has already talked about. Pip's Bunch, a man who works at Credit Suisse, his name is Philip, and who goes to work on a Friday dressed in women's clothing and a wig, and is called Pips, and had been given this award for women in business. So I tweeted, if you were asked to be on a panel with Pip's Bunch, what would you do to my male followers? And that kicked off a conversation. So then there were about 200 tweets over the course of a few days, as you get these sort of running conversations, and people started to unpick the questions. I wasn't really asking about Pip's bunts. I was asking, what do you think a woman is, and do you think that policies that were developed to protect women should be flexed to, to accommodate men who want to identify female all the time, or some of the time. um, and I was really surprised by the responses I got from from guys that I worked with, or in the sort of broader networks, who are normally like, they're economists, they're scientists, you know they're not sort of fluffy people, and they were saying, well, if he feels like at least partly like a woman, then why wouldn't we accommodate him? So that, anyway, that sort of all happened in October. And I didn't know this at the time, but there were complaints in Washington, D.C. So the organization I worked for was a US think tank with a European arm, and I worked in London in the European arm. But there were a couple of women in Washington who they weren't even formal complaints. They were just, they were concerned about the fact that I was talking about this. And so I got a email saying, would you put a disclaimer on your tweets to say that they're not, all opinions your own? And so I said I would do that. And they said, we don't want to use exclusionary language. And my response was, well, definitions are exclusionary. You have, if you have a concept or a definition, it's going to exclude some people, because that's how language and concepts and statistics and understanding works. And I really thought at the time, I was working for this organization that had allowed people to have differences of opinion, that wasn't particularly pushing this agenda, and that does lots of work on women and girls in developing countries. So maternal mortality, early marriage, even birth certificates, the importance of birth certificates for children, and for protection against child labor. I really didn't think that this would happen to me, and I partly felt like I was possibly a bit safe because I was in this organization that allowed you to have debate, and I found out that was not true. So over the course of about 6 months, there was sort of gradually bits of a job offer were taken away from me in a sort of slightly complicated way, so that at the end of the 6 months, the whole job had disappeared. This job that I'd been working on to develop a project where we'd been applying for funding, and when the funding came in, the job offer for me had disappeared. And so that was International Women's Day 2 years ago. I just lost my job. And I'd been working on an article. So this was kind of the first long form thing that I'd written about this topic, which was about how it related to international development organizations. I tweeted it for International Women's Day, and I wrote a thread. And in the thread, I said, I lost my job. And at that point, I didn't think I had any employment rights, because I wasn't a full-time employee. I hadn't thought about bringing a case. And my dad had a very long court case, and I'd always swore that I would never sue anybody. So it just wasn't something that was on my mind. But I tweeted that I'd lost my job, and the feminist lawyers kind of arrived like the fairy godmothers, and said, you've been discriminated against because of your belief. And I mean, I hadn't even thought about this thing as being a belief. To me, it was, it's obvious that men are men and women are women. There are two sexes. You can't change sex. That's important in some situations. It doesn't have to impinge on the human rights of people who identify as transgender. And so I filed a claim to the Employment Tribunal, and it's a discrimination claim on the basis of belief. And so then I had to fund it, because I have to pay the lawyers. So I started a crowdfunder in May of 2019. and that was probably the first time first time people had heard of me. Was I started the crowdfunder. We had the story in the newspaper, and raised £60,000 in 3 days, which was the fastest crowdfunder that the platform had that year at that point. And yeah, it was just amazing. I sort of spent 2 days sitting on my sofa in my pajamas, just watching, because you get comments coming in from people and lots of people like me, when I gave to a crowdfunder, they were doing it anonymously. It's something that they could do to support somebody who could speak out, mainly from women, but some men. And yeah, just amazing to kind of have that support behind you, to have thousands of people supporting you. And so
the judgment was quite shocking, actually. I think.
Yes, then the judgment. So then the case was about belief discrimination, and it's a preliminary hearing just on one piece of my case, which is the question of, is the belief that sex is real, immutable and important, a philosophical belief that deserves protection under the Equality Act? So as Helen said, there are 9 protected characteristics. Religion and belief is one of them, and it includes non-belief, so atheism, and it also includes non-religious beliefs. But in order to be protected, you have to show that your belief is coherent, serious, not it can be scientific, but it can't just be a sort of a piece of science that might be disproved tomorrow by another piece of evidence. It has to be a sort of fundamental truth, or something you believe is a fundamental truth. And it has to be worthy of respect in a democratic society, which means it mustn't undermine other people's fundamental human rights. And so the cases that have lost on this category are basically being a Nazi, or being a violent revolutionary who will overthrow the government. It's the bar is very low to get over for a view to be worthy of respect in a democratic society. And we were, as you say, we were shocked when the judgment came out that this belief was judged not to be worthy, and we think that judgment is wrong, and it's going to appeal on the 27th and 28th of April. So hopefully it's going to the Employment Appeal Tribunal, and they will look again at the judgment.
In some ways, when there's an overreach with gender ideology, it is an own goal. Having said all that, though, because it brings it out into the sunlight, and obviously none of these arguments really stand up in the sunlight, or the theoretical framework as such does not stand up with any kind of rigor attached to it. But so I just want to say thank you from all of us for taking that case, and for all of the applicants taking all the different cases in the UK, because I'm sure that comes at a personal cost to do that to everyone in terms of time and just the emotional energy, but it does shine a light, so thank you so much. It's funny, actually, Anya Palmer put into the chat earlier when Fiona was talking about them, Philip Bunce deserves an award for enhancing so many.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that's true. I think that's very true. We need to get an award to him, not Businesswoman of the Year, but so you mentioned there at the beginning about your new organization. I mean, I've been following you and all your writing, but now you've put this all together with a view to activism around a specific part of this movement. And can you tell me a bit about that? It's just after launching, so just tell us the whole spiel about your
so Sex Matters, that's basically what we're about. It's a single issue campaign to re-establish clarity about sex in law and policy, language and culture. Initially focused on the UK, but as I say, I think if we can make headway on this in the UK, it's got to help others. I've co-founded it with Naomi Cunningham and Rebecca Bull, who are 2 lawyers, and with Dr. Emma Hilton, who's a biologist who people may have, she's spoken at Fair Play for Women events. So a bit of science and a bit of law and activism, and it's aiming to connect the dots between all of the issues. So, you know, we have sex matters in schools, it matters in safeguarding, it matters in sports, it matters in prisons. And the way that sex self-ID has been brought in has, you know, has not been all of those things have been connected, and yet we're kind of playing whack-a-mole in trying to deal with them. So I think we need a campaign that will bring all of that together, that will support the organizations that are already doing things, but will also kind of join the dots, and will also bring in men, you know, people who are concerned about this for freedom of speech reasons, people who are concerned about governance, about good governance and decision making. You know, it's not only feminists or radical feminists who this matters for. You know, it matters for everyone. It matters, you know, if you're a father or a you know, a parent. Obviously it matters more for women, but I think ultimately it matters for anybody who cares about government and democracy. And so that's what we want to do. We're non-partisan, and we're going to work with everybody. And we launched on Friday, but we've been sort of going behind the scenes since before Christmas, putting in submissions to the various government consultations, starting to engage with policymakers and with journalists and with experts, and you know, sort of being part of that debate. So that's yeah, that's Sex Matters.
I think that's so true what you're saying about you know, this movement. Obviously it's powered a lot by feminists and a lot of radical feminists as well, because of the framework, but I completely agree with you. You know, we always say that at the Countess, that what we have in Ireland is a reordering of society. You know, we now have a sex class called women, which includes some men who identify as women, and that is a fundamental restructuring, reordering of society at its most basic core. And we weren't asked if we wanted this to happen. And I completely agree with you. This is about a democratic deficit. You know, who's making these laws? Who is pushing for them? People aren't even aware of what they do. And I completely agree. When they find out what they do, that any man at any time can fill out a form. And in our law, it's for all purposes. They change their sex for all purposes.
Yeah.
Which means they can access all of those spaces that you just described. And of course, you know, I think it's very true that 9 out of 10 people don't agree with that, you know, and it's about those people feeling empowered to speak out. And going back to your point about definitions as well, that's always been one of my issues. When I was trying to get my head around gender ideology at the beginning, and I was thinking, but you know, everything is so circular, you know, it's the theoretical framework is so wishy-washy. It's all based on feelings. We can't legislate based on feelings. That's just bad law.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about actually toilets, because when I founded the Countess at the very beginning, I was given advice not to go near them, don't talk about them, they're not interesting, it's really reductive, people don't really care. And I do understand how, like in America, obviously the whole toilet wars, the bathroom wars, they probably don't call them the toilet wars, bathroom wars, and they talk, you know, they say, oh, we just want to pee. And so yes, it can be quite reductive, but I actually disagree with not going there. I think it's almost, we have to hold this line. I think it's almost, you know, I fundamentally think that women and girls need, require and deserve and require their own toilets. And actually, it's almost the most insidious creep in a way. Like, it costs nothing. It's a few minutes to just change the sticker on the door to gender neutral. And in just, you know, in a second, you've obliterated that single sex provision for women. Can you tell me a little bit about your research in this specific area?
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think, you know, this redefinition of the language of men and women is, you know, is such a huge and fundamental thing. And as you say, it was done without consultation, you know, without consultation about what it would mean. And it's been presented as being it's just admin, or it's just about being compassionate. And so, you know, we have in the UK, the Gender Recognition Act is also for all purposes. And you look at the discussions that took place in Parliament when they were putting that through, and they sort of said, well, you know, there are so many laws that mention sex or mention men and women, and we can't consider each of them. So let's just say for all purposes, because it's neat, you know, we don't have to think about all of those different times when sex is mentioned in the law. And I think what's happening now is you do have to, you know, it's the Chesterton's fence idea. You know, if you have a law or a boundary that was put up for a reason, before you take it down, you have to understand what that boundary was put there for. And so when you think about for all purposes, what does that mean? And that does, you know, it does mean prisons, but I think, you know, it does also require that we think about toilets. And so we started this because the government here is did a call for evidence through the Ministry of Communities and Local Government about toilets for men and women. And the consultation was asking partly about gender neutral toilets, but also about signage and rules around toilets. And even the consultation talked about gender, didn't talk about sex. And so, you know, the first thing in our response was, this is what sex means in biology. This is what sex means in the law. This is why, if you say gender, you're already confusing things. You're already making it difficult to say what it is that you're giving away. And so that's sort of the first bit of our response. And our response to this consultation ends up running to 60 pages, which they probably you know, weren't expecting quite so much, but we thought we'd take the opportunity to write down everything about toilets, because as you say, I think it's the one topic that people don't want to go too close to, because I think people come into this, you know, issue and, you know, they can see that there are big problems in that, you know, there are issues in sport, there are issues in prisons, but toilets seems like an area where, you know, nobody wants to get into a conflict. And, you know, and we're told it's fine. Trans women have been using women's toilets forever. Nobody's complained. You know, why are women complaining now? And I think there's two things. One, that's not true. So if, you know, even Stonewall has done, does these surveys, and they find that I think it's 46% of transgender people in their surveys say they don't feel comfortable going to the toilet, and I think 36% say they've been discriminated against in a cafe or a bar or a public place. It doesn't say what it means by discriminated against, in terms of, does it mean, you know, not being able to go to the toilet you want to, or not being allowed in at all. But, you know, trans people are feeling uncomfortable, women are feeling uncomfortable. So if you ask in a survey of men and women, what do they think about trans women using women's toilets, I think it's around 50% will say yes, and it changes with age. So the older women are more likely to say no, younger women are much more likely to say yes. But if the survey is made clear, what does trans woman mean in this question? It means somebody who may not have had any surgery, have no intention of having surgery. Then the numbers go down. So then you get around 30% of people say yes, I'd be comfortable, or, you know, trans women should be allowed to use women's toilets, but 70% are saying no. And I think, as you said, it's, even if some women are willing to say you can pee next to me, that doesn't mean they can give that away for other women. So I think, you know, toilets is really important. We do have to go there, and it's not rocket science. What we need for toilets is clear rules that everyone understands, so people understand where they're allowed to go and where they're not, and who they might come into contact with there. And those rules are going to be the same for toilets, showers, gyms, changing rooms. And the obvious solution is to have, you know, a unisex option. So if people don't feel comfortable for whatever reason using the same sex facilities for their own sex, there's, you know, there's a unisex option where no one's going to ask questions, where they don't have to, it's not a comment on their gender identity or their passing. It's just a place where everyone gets to have privacy. So, you know, I think we need to move away from thinking toilets are a test of the authenticity of someone's gender identity and their acceptance. But if you look back in the history of how this all happened, that's what doctors have pushed. Doctors set people with gender dysphoria, people who are seeking transition. That was one of the tests that they set them to say, go out and use the women's toilets and see if you get challenged. See, you know, they sort of set it as if it was like a jungle. Go and explore this this, you know, uncharted territory, and see if you can prove yourself. And, you know, women never consented to being, you know, the test subjects for people's gender identity. And I think it particularly gets pushed into workplace toilets. So work and you know, we have men and women's toilets. It's not just by culture or by tradition, it's by law. So employers have to provide toilets and changing, you know, if they need changing facilities for employees segregated by sex. So do you know, pubs, clubs, all of those kind of restaurants, cafes, licensed venues all have to provide men and women's toilets unless they are unisex. So if you have a single room, closed room with a sink that's like, you know, like your toilet at home, then that can be unisex. But if you have a bank of cubicles and a bank of cubicles and urinals, that's separate. And workplaces are required to provide that. And workplaces are the place where people who transition are using, you know, being told by their doctors that that's the test of whether they are transitioning, is whether they're allowed into the women's toilets. But
so with so much of this, we just see a complete lack of regard for women's you know, how women feel about any of these changes, you know, not even considered, you know. It's extraordinary, isn't it, really?
Exactly. And kind of women in prisons and women in the workplace are the captive audience. You know, you're required by the rules to comply, and you know, and girls in school. So if the institution says we are letting males into this space, it's very difficult in those situations for women and girls to say no. Whereas in a pub or you know, a public place, they can leave. And now you're seeing policies being set by workplaces that say the minute a person says, I'm planning to transition, they should be allowed to use whichever toilet they choose. And so then it's not even the original point of it, which was to test whether somebody socially was accepted, has been stripped away, because there is no chance for the female colleagues to do anything but be socially accepting, because if they don't, their job's at risk.
And similarly, girls in a school where, you know, I mean, in every country we see the same methodology. We see the Trojan horse of anti-bullying in schools, and we see diversity training in the workplace. But with schools, you know, we always think, well, the guidance is that that girl who feels uncomfortable should be separated and re-educated. I mean, so it's quite an aggressive way to push this ideology and to force young women especially to ignore their instincts, you know, that keep them safe, and to be scolded and told that those instincts are that instinctive reaction is you being a bigot, you know, you being conservative.
And you know, it's one thing, it was hard enough for me to stand up to this as a, you know, as a grown woman, as a mother, you know, as someone who's been around the block a few times. But for young girls, you know, to have to say, I don't
I'm okay with
accept
it.
this, I think is really,
Yeah.
it's really impossible.
Yeah.
And the law doesn't require it. You know, that's the thing. They're being sold this policy by lobbying institutions and often by the government itself. So, you know, by the Equality and Human Rights Commission and the Government Equalities Office, whose job it is to look after everyone, you know, whose job it is to communicate the law, which, you know, we have quite a decent law that should protect everyone with all those characteristics, like Helen said, and is not doing that, is using the Equality Act against women and girls, against their boundaries. And so that's what we want to challenge, and give people the tools to understand the law and to use it, you know, in their workplaces, in their schools.
One of our concerns actually is that if, and this is, it's important to add actually that this is already signed off in our legislative programme for government. So it is likely to be pushed through without very much legislative pre-leg scrutiny. And that is an amendment to our own, which is slightly different in Ireland, but to all of our equality legislation to include gender identity as a ground. And our very grave concern and fear would be that that would be used, you know, it'll be impossible for me as a mother to accost a man who walks into the ladies' toilets when I'm there with my little girl, because that would be to discriminate against him if he identifies as female. So it could do away with the need for certification at all, even though the system of self-ID in Ireland, there is no medical gatekeeping anyway. There's no criminal or legal gatekeeping. No one has ever been refused. And obviously, as we've discussed plenty already, men in the middle of live rape trials and trials for sexual offences are granted these certificates. But this would be a further step where just by someone's say so, in terms of their identity, that identity would be protected.
And I think, I mean, sorry, can I?
Yes.
In the UK, we, you know, only about 5,000 people have a gender recognition certificate. It was intended to be for this very small group, and to date it has been a quite small group. But it's got, I don't know if you have this in Ireland, but it's got this very strong confidentiality protection, so that if somebody has a gender recognition certificate, it becomes a criminal offence for somebody who's found that out through the course of their job, to then share that information. And you know, the problem with that is, if somebody has a birth certificate that says they're female and the person can see that they're male, then they have that information, because, you know, you can't change sex, and often people can tell. And so then you've made the question, what sex are you, such a dangerous question to ask anybody, because you've given, you know, ordinary, you know, an 18-year-old receptionist on the gym at the sports centre asking a question which may become a criminal offence, to then deal with the information. So then they go, well, we're not going to ask anybody's sex, we'll just say gender because it's safer. So even though we don't have self-ID, and even though only 5,000 people have changed their sex, it's already been, because of this confidentiality, it's been sort of scratched from all policies and public life.
So there's a lot of you know, hard days in this movement, but I have to say, I think I speak for all of us when I say we were all pretty elated when we watched the House of Lords amendment to the maternity bill in England. It was just so wonderful to see so many men and women stand up and speak up for women and for mothers, in particular. In Ireland, you know, language is so important, and we've talked about that a lot today. But of all of our pillars of concern as an advocacy group, language is the one that has flared up quite a lot. It's very much a live issue in Ireland, and the reason is for specific historical reasons, that we have an ongoing cervical cancer screening scandal, and then a follow-up, a cover-up. And women were basically given false negatives, and they're now going through the courts. They've been dragged through the courts, and many of them have small children and they're dying, and hundreds were affected. And that very the same screening, National Health Service, our health executive, quietly dropped the word women from that screening listure, from that service. And naturally enough, there was outcry, and then they put it back on, but they've dropped it again. They don't seem to be acting in good faith in terms of what we are requesting. But the outcry was because, you know, it was very raw. And I think similarly with the word mother, I think people just feel they experience it as an assault to women to take the word mother from them, and to humanity, because we're all born from mothers. So can you tell us a bit about your briefing, the background, the briefing that you gave the House of Lords?
So, you know, this, as I said, it's like whack-a-mole, that self-ID is being pushed into any law, you know, because so many laws do recognize sex, there are so many places to push it into, so hate crime, you know, building standards, and so it got pushed into this law that was being passed, which was about maternity leave for ministers, for government ministers, because they don't have the same coverage as ordinary employees. And basically this law would cover one minister who is pregnant and about to give birth, so it was quite urgent. And the reason it will only cover one minister is they will update it. They're going to add you know, potentially adoption leave and paternity leave, so this law is really only kind of an emergency measure for this one woman who is about to give birth. And so it was being pushed through the House very quickly. And the first thing we saw of it, you know, somebody said to me, it doesn't say woman in it, and it doesn't say mother in it. It says pregnant person and person who has given birth. And, you know, this is in the context of women's charities talking about cervix havers, you know, birth charities talking about, you know, birthing people and menopausal people, and, you know, people who menstruate, as J.K. Rowling pointed out. And so we had not a very long time to respond to this, and it, you know, was presented as being, well, it's this very small bill, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't matter very much, it's really only for this one woman, and why are you making such a fuss about it? But we thought we would, and so we spoke to legal professors, you know, people who know about drafting. And so what had happened was, when this bill was put forward, the government said, we can't use the word woman because of a policy that was put in place in 2007 on gender neutral drafting. They said, Parliament, we're not able to use the word woman in relation to maternity leave, which seemed a bit odd, because there are lots of laws that use the word woman in relation to maternity leave. And so we talked to the professors of legal interpretation who kind of pointed us at this policy, which was brought. There is a policy on gender neutral drafting, and it was brought in because before that, all the laws used to say he, you know, or you talk about the chairman, or, you know, everything was written in terms of he, and it was understood that that included women, but that they used he as the default person. And so in order to change expectations and culture, they had decided to use gender neutral language, to talk about the person who, and to not use pronouns in laws in 2007. But even in the guidance on that, they said where it relates to a job that can be done by a man or a woman. And clearly being pregnant, giving birth is not a job that can be done by a man or a woman. It's a job that can only be done by a woman. And so we put together a briefing explaining this, and also explaining there was a case in the UK over the last couple of years of a trans man, so a woman who identifies as a man, who'd gone through the gender recognition certificate process, so is legally says male on the birth certificate, had then gone for fertility treatment, so artificial insemination, in order to get pregnant, gone through the pregnancy, had a baby, did not want to be named as a mother on the birth certificate, wanted to be named as the father. And this person had gone to court to say, it's my right not to be the mother, but to be the father. And that's gone through, it's gone to the Court of Appeal, and it's due to go to the Supreme Court. But so far, the courts have said, no, the person who gives birth to a child is the mother. And the reason why is because it's because of the child's right. It's the child's right to know who gave birth to them. And it's the child's right to have somebody who is responsible for them at the moment of they come into the world. You know, the father may not be there. He may or may not be there, but the mother is there. Physically, the mother is there. And now you have egg donation and so on. The mother may not be the biological mother. Usually 99 times out of 100 she is, but she is there. She's physically the person who's carried that child for 9 months and given birth to them. And if there's any decisions to be made about that child after the moment of birth, that's her responsibility. That's her domain. And
legally, isn't it?
Yeah, legally it is. And so to sever that link between a mother and a child at birth in order to satisfy a person's gender identity that they didn't want to be named as mother, the court said no. And when they brought the Gender Recognition Act in, they never thought that somebody who feels so strongly that they don't want to be a woman would also want to go through pregnancy and birth. So like when they said for all purposes, they didn't think through what that means in relation to biology carrying on. So we wrote a briefing that explained about that and explained about gender neutral drafting, and we shared it with the MPs and with the Lords, and they appreciated it. And particularly in the House of Lords, a sort of debate kicked off that had not happened before, and it was about this word woman and mother. It was about this bill, but it was like a plaster had been ripped off, and the Lords who hadn't spoken about this before talked about women losing their jobs. They talked about rape crisis centres being defunded because they were women only. They talked about the abuse and hatred that's been heaped on people like J.K. Rowling, Rosie Duffield, MP, who's spoken up about this. So they sort of started with this one word and this one very small bill, and they talked about everything. And it feels like Pandora's box has been opened a bit, and it's not going to go back in. So we need to keep building on that momentum and making it safe for people to talk about this and to recognize what everybody knows.
And I think there's something powerful about something being said in the same way that if something is said in open court or is in a judgment, there's a real power to that in terms of the public sphere. Likewise, if the Lords speak, and as they did so eloquently. And I also have a theory. I think, a lot of people, their gateway to this movement is free speech, and then they may have different levels of engagement with the feminist, with the, they may or may not, if they're not women and they're not feminists, they may not particularly care about our safe spaces, or it may not even occur to them, but they might really be prepared to die on the hill in terms of free speech. But I think personally that I think the word mother is one of those kind of gateway things as well. I think it really does impact people for that very reason. It's, the kind of the proto relationship. It's where we all come from. And I think it is one of those things that will push the conversation more into the mainstream for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we have all these stupid discussions on Twitter, and one of them is like, what's the definition of woman? And the one we say is it's about, or female is about producing large gametes, and that sounds like this really obscure, weird scientific thing. Large gametes are eggs, small motile gametes are sperm. It sounds so obscure, but having the type of body that produces large gametes affects girls from the day of birth, but certainly from puberty, all through their adult life. And it's that's what it takes to be a mother. Not every woman is a mother, but every mother is a woman, and everybody had a mother and came from that. And if our laws can't reflect that and support that most fundamental relationship to human survival, then they're no good.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think we sever the link between the child and the mother, in language and in law at our peril, really. But thank you so much for talking to us. It was an absolute pleasure.
Having me.
Thank you, Maya. And
good luck with
thank
everything.
you. Thank you very much.